The courthouse buzzed with an electric mix of tension and triumph that morning. Inside the expansive, high-ceilinged hall, the air was thick with whispered speculations and the rustle of expensive suits as reporters jostled for a prime view of the proceedings. In one of the polished wood-paneled corridors, Officers Ulysses Hopper and Wayland Stokes emerged, their faces masked in confident smiles that barely concealed the nerves beneath. Moments earlier, they had been on trial for charges of corruption, a case that had gripped the city with scandal and disbelief. Now, buoyed by the unexpected not guilty verdict, they strode out as if exhaling years of pent-up stress, their every step punctuating the jubilant murmur that spread among the gathered crowd. Outside the courtroom, sunlight streamed through tall glass windows, casting elongated shadows on the marble floor and lending a surreal glow to the celebration. Ulysses, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a meticulously trimmed beard and piercing blue eyes, exchanged hearty handshakes and congratulatory nods with a group of his colleagues, many of whom had long walked the blurred line between right and wrong. Wayland, slightly leaner and known for his quick wit, laughed boisterously as he clinked his champagne glass against those of his accomplices. Their smiles and laughter were an ode to their perceived invincibility, a shared belief that they had outwitted the system that had once threatened to dismantle their lucrative, albeit corrupt, operations. Amid the celebration, as the officers mingled with a crowd of influential figures and local dignitaries, a solitary figure lingered at the periphery. Draped in a tailored, dark suit that contrasted sharply with the bright hues of the day, the man's eyes swept the room with a calm intensity. His gaze was not celebratory but analytical, as though he were cataloguing every detail for reasons known only to himself. There was something magnetic about his presence, a quiet authority that made even the most boisterous revelers pause in silent acknowledgement. The air seemed to grow heavier around him, the buoyant laughter and careless chatter momentarily subdued by the weight of his unspoken promise. For Ulysses and Wayland, the verdict was more than just a legal victory, it was a triumphant vindication of their clandestine lifestyle. As they stepped into the bright afternoon light, they exchanged a conspiratorial glance that spoke of shared secrets and the unspoken understanding that their world was about to change again. They had escaped the clutches of the justice system, at least for now, and reveled in the fleeting taste of power, blissfully unaware that the stage was set for a revelation that would soon shatter the very foundation of their corrupt empire. Every detail of the day, the polished surfaces of the courthouse, the crisp sound of laughter echoing in the corridors, and the determined, almost predatory glint in the eyes of the lone stranger, foreshadowed an intricate drama yet to unfold. In that charged atmosphere, where victory and foreboding intermingled, the story of Ulysses Hopper and Wayland Stokes was only beginning. Their celebration, however opulent and raucous, would soon give way to a twist so profound that it promised to rewrite the rules of the game they had long taken for granted. And as the city's elite and ordinary citizens alike basked in the afterglow of a verdict that defied expectations, the silent observer watched, patiently waiting for the moment when all the masks would finally be stripped away the day after the courthouse celebration, while the city still buzzed with whispers of scandal and triumph, an undercurrent of unease began to permeate the streets. In a quiet corner of a bustling downtown cafe, a man in a crisp, dark suit sat alone at a small table near the window. His presence was unassuming at first glance, yet every deliberate gesture and measured sip of black coffee spoke of a mind that was constantly at work. This man, Enoch Spade, had been the silent observer in the courtroom the previous day, and now he seemed to be weaving himself further into the fabric of the unfolding drama. Enoch's eyes, a piercing shade of gray, scanned the busy scene with an intensity that belied the casual atmosphere. He was not merely a passive onlooker, his mind was occupied with meticulous calculations and strategic plans. Every detail around him, the muted conversations, the clink of porcelain cups, the rustle of newspaper pages, contributed to a mental inventory of the day's events. He recalled the confident swagger of Ulysses Hopper and the almost mocking laughter of Wayland Stokes as they strolled from the courthouse, celebrating their recent acquittal. Yet, even as he observed their jubilant behavior, Enoch's thoughts were far from celebratory. He knew that beneath the veneer of public triumph lay secrets that could topple empires, and he was determined to be the catalyst for their inevitable downfall. Outside the cafe, the city was alive with the energy of ordinary citizens and news crews capturing every moment of the ongoing saga. But Enoch remained in his secluded world, his attention focused on his secure phone and a leather-bound dossier resting on the table. The dossier contained meticulously compiled evidence and confidential reports, collected over months of relentless investigation. It was a tapestry of the corruption that had infected the police department, a web of deceit spun by men who had long considered themselves invincible. Enoch's mind revisited every detail, every misstep made by Ulysses and Wayland, and he felt a deep-seated responsibility to bring them to justice. It wasn't a simple matter of retribution, it was about restoring a balance that had long been disrupted by unchecked power. As the afternoon progressed, Enoch left the cafe and strolled along the city sidewalks, his pace unhurried yet purposeful. The urban landscape around him seemed to change in his perception, every passerby, every whispered conversation, and every flicker of a street lamp served as a reminder of the fragile nature of trust and authority. He recalled the moment in the courthouse when the two officers had basked in their hollow victory, a victory that was now overshadowed by the weight of their crimes. In his mind, the path to redemption for the city lay in exposing the truth, no matter how deep or dark the roots of corruption might be. His journey took him to a quiet, inconspicuous building that housed a covert federal office. Inside, Enoch met with a small group of dedicated agents, their faces marked by resolve and weariness from years of battling systemic corruption. In a hushed tone, he detailed his observations from the previous day, emphasizing the significance of the unspoken details he had witnessed, a furtive glance, a lingering smirk, a subtle shift in posture. His colleagues listened intently as he recounted the nuances of the officer's behavior, each detail reinforcing the narrative of a carefully constructed facade that was now beginning to crumble. As the meeting progressed, Enoch outlined the next steps in his plan. It was clear that the celebration of Ulysses and Wayland was not the end of their story but merely a prelude to the reckoning that was to come. The agents would intensify their surveillance, gather more incontrovertible evidence, and prepare to dismantle the network of corruption piece by piece. There was a palpable determination in the room, a shared understanding that the road ahead would be treacherous, yet necessary for the sake of justice and the community's trust in law enforcement. In the quiet moments that followed the meeting, Enoch found himself alone in his modest office, poring over additional files and reviewing intercepted communications. Every new piece of information further painted the picture of a deeply entrenched system of corruption, one that had thrived on secrecy and impunity. Yet, amid the darkness of the revelations, a spark of hope burned within him. It was the conviction that with unwavering persistence and ethical resolve, even the most powerful conspiracies could be unraveled. And as he prepared to set the next phase of his operation into motion, Enoch Spade steeled himself for the challenges ahead, fully aware that the path to true justice would demand sacrifices, but also bring about a transformation that promised a brighter, more accountable future for all. Later that evening, the scene shifted from the stately corridors of the courthouse to the opulent interiors of a high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. Soft classical music floated through the air, mingling with the low hum of hushed conversations and the clinking of fine china. Ulysses Hopper and Wayland Stokes found themselves seated at a secluded corner table, away from prying eyes yet not entirely hidden from the curious glances of fellow diners. The restaurant, adorned with rich mahogany furnishings and ornate crystal fixtures, provided a stark contrast to the earlier chaos of the courtroom, a haven where power and decadence seemed to merge effortlessly. As the evening unfolded, the two officers reveled in the intoxicating sense of invincibility that their recent legal victory had bestowed upon them. Their table was laden with an array of sumptuous dishes, succulent steaks drizzled with delicate sauces, artfully arranged seafood platters, and an assortment of vibrant, seasonal vegetables. The soft, ambient lighting accentuated the gleam in their eyes as they exchanged knowing smiles and boisterous laughter. Toasts were made repeatedly, each clink of their crystal glasses echoing their defiant claim to freedom and power. Yet, as the wine flowed and the conversation deepened, an undercurrent of disquiet began to weave its way through their banter. Between tales of past exploits, stories of covert deals, daring bribes, and the dark art of evading accountability, the memory of the mysterious figure from the courtroom began to haunt them. Ulysses recounted, with a mix of pride and bitterness, the times when they had outsmarted both the system and their rivals. Waylon, always the more flamboyant of the pair, laughed loudly as he recalled the elaborate schemes they had executed. However, beneath the veneer of arrogance, a subtle tension was visible. Each mention of their exploit seemed to be shadowed by an unspoken reminder of that stranger's piercing gaze, a gaze that had lingered far too long in their peripheral vision. In the midst of the revelry, as the evening wore on and the initial euphoria started to give way to introspection, Ulysses suddenly fell silent. His eyes, normally so full of confidence, darkened as if recalling a dream that refused to fade. The chatter around him seemed to dissolve into a murmur, and for a fleeting moment, he stared off into space, lost in thought. Waylon noticed the shift in his partner's demeanor, a momentary crack in the armor of their bravado, and gently prodded him for an explanation. With a voice barely above a whisper, Ulysses recalled the enigmatic words of the stranger, a promise of retribution that had been delivered with unnerving calm, a forewarning that their celebrated victory might be nothing more than a temporary respite. As the conversation resumed, the atmosphere at the table grew charged with a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. Waylon's jovial tone softened, and he too began to recount memories that were tinged with regret, a series of near misses, whispers of internal investigations, and silent warnings from those who had once trusted them. The narrative they spun was intricate, a tapestry of both triumph and impending doom, where each colorful thread of past misdeeds was now interlaced with the foreboding sense of inevitable reckoning. Throughout the dinner, the interplay of light and shadow in the restaurant mirrored the inner turmoil of the two men. The once carefree laughter now came with a trace of irony, as if each chuckle was laced with the bitter understanding that their fortunes could change in an instant. Outside the large windows that overlooked the busy street, passers-by remained oblivious to the high-stakes drama unfolding within the warmly lit dining room. Yet inside, every clink of a glass, every pause in conversation, seemed to underscore the growing realization that their world, a world built on secrecy and corruption, was teetering on the edge of collapse. By the time dessert was served, a delicate arrangement of artisan pastries and freshly brewed espresso, the mood had transformed into one of contemplative silence. The officers no longer spoke with the same reckless abandon as before. Instead, they exchanged guarded glances, each word measured and heavy with the weight of their shared history. They knew that beneath the veneer of celebration lay the seed of their downfall, a seed planted long ago, nurtured in the shadows of power, and now sprouting into an undeniable reckoning. In that moment, as the last notes of the piano echoed softly in the background and the restaurant's lights dimmed in preparation for closing, Ulysses and Waylon understood that their future was uncertain. The joyous clamor of victory had given way to a quiet dread that whispered of secrets yet to be revealed, of alliances that were fraying at the edges, and of a mysterious force that was already setting the stage for the next act of their unraveling. And while the sumptuous meal and lavish surroundings had once served as a reminder of their triumph, they now stood as stark contrasts to the dark reality that loomed ahead, a reality where every indulgence and every boast might ultimately be their undoing. The morning after the restaurant dinner, a chill of apprehension replaced the lingering warmth of the previous night. The precinct, usually a hive of organized chaos, now resonated with an unusual stillness. As Ulysses and Waylon walked through the stark, fluorescent-lit corridors, the air seemed to hum with whispered rumors of impending change. Colleagues exchanged furtive glances and murmurs that hinted at a disruption, something that had unsettled even the most jaded officers. In the main office, an atmosphere of tight-lipped urgency had taken hold. Files were shuffled and hushed conversations filled the spaces between clacking keyboards. The two officers, who had so recently basked in the glow of a courtroom victory, now felt a heavy, oppressive weight on their shoulders. It was as though the very walls of the building were closing in on them, absorbing every nervous whisper and anxious sigh. Before they could reach their individual desks, the shrill ring of a telephone shattered the tense silence. Both Ulysses and Waylon exchanged uneasy looks as a voice, firm and devoid of emotion, announced that they were required to report to a high-level meeting immediately. The call came from a number they didn't recognize, but the tone carried a sense of authority that brooked no argument. In that instant, any remnants of their earlier bravado began to evaporate, replaced by a cold dread that seeped into their bones. As they entered the designated meeting room, a stark, conference hall with long tables and chairs arranged in an almost militaristic precision, they were met by a gathering of stern-faced administrators and officers whose expressions betrayed nothing of the turbulent events they had just experienced. The room's ambience was a study in contrasts. The polished surfaces and crisp uniforms clashed sharply with the palpable tension and heavy silence that pervaded the space. Every eye seemed to be watching them, each gaze laden with unspoken questions and cautious judgments. At the head of the table, a senior official began speaking in a measured tone, detailing recent developments that no one had anticipated. Rumors of a federal inquiry had spread overnight, and whispers of internal investigations had already set in motion a chain of events that threatened to upend the established order. The official's words, though delivered in calm, clipped sentences, carried the weight of inevitability, a promise that the days of unchecked authority were numbered. Ulysses' mind raced as he listened to the allegations being quietly recounted. The discussion veered into sensitive details about financial discrepancies, dubious transactions, and unauthorized communications, all threads that, when woven together, painted a damning portrait of systemic corruption. The room grew even more silent as the official mentioned names and incidents that could not be easily dismissed. It was as if every misstep, every secret handshake from their past, was being summoned before them, threatening to shatter the illusion of invulnerability they had long clung to. Wayland's face, usually animated by a blend of humor and bravado, was now etched with a deepening frown. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Ulysses with eyes that silently pleaded for reassurance, a reassurance that now felt impossibly elusive. The minutes dragged on, each one intensifying the sense of impending doom. In the background, the low murmur of a ticking clock underscored the relentless march of time toward an uncertain reckoning. The meeting took an unexpected turn when a high-ranking federal agent stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention. The agent's calm yet authoritative tone cut through the room, announcing that further investigations were to be coordinated immediately, and that no one, regardless of past courtroom victories, was immune to scrutiny. His words were precise, each one a measured blow that dismantled the comfortable cocoon of invincibility that Ulysses and Wayland had built around themselves. In that charged moment, a cold realization set in for both men. The celebration of their recent triumph was nothing more than a brief interlude before the storm. The seemingly routine day had transformed into a battlefield of words and evidence, a place where every lie would soon be exposed and every secret laid bare. The room, with its stark white walls and unyielding fluorescent lights, became a silent witness to the shattering of an empire built on corruption and deceit. As the meeting drew to a close, the senior official's parting words echoed in the minds of Ulysses and Wayland. They were reminded that justice, once deferred, had a way of catching up with even the most deeply entrenched wrongdoers. With heavy hearts and minds racing with regret and fear, the two officers left the room, their steps slower and their expressions marked by an unfamiliar vulnerability. In that moment, the early promise of unchecked power gave way to the bitter taste of impending accountability, a turning point that would forever alter the course of their lives and the future of the institution they once believed to be unassailable. In the hushed stillness of the conference room, the tension reached its apex when the door opened once again. A tall, composed figure in a crisp suit strode in with deliberate calm, his eyes scanning the room with a disarming intensity. The assembled administrators and officers fell silent, their earlier murmurs dissolving into a pregnant pause. With a measured tone, the man introduced himself, his words cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a knife through cloth. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and unwavering. "My name is Enoch Spade, yes, that is correct, and I am the FBI director." A ripple of shock passed through the room. For a moment, disbelief reigned as Ulysses Hopper and Wayland Stokes exchanged wide-eyed glances, their confident facades crumbling under the weight of his revelation. The director continued, methodically laying out the evidence that had been compiled over months, evidence that spanned internal emails, confidential financial ledgers, and covert recordings of incriminating conversations. Every document he presented painted a damning portrait of systemic corruption, a web that Ulysses and Wayland had so intricately woven to protect themselves. He placed a thick dossier on the table before him, sliding it slowly toward the two officers. "These files contain every misdeed you thought was hidden," he stated plainly. "Fraudulent transactions, tampered reports, and even the orchestration of crimes that went far beyond local misconduct. The very system you exploited to shield yourselves is now unraveling before your eyes." As he spoke, his gaze was unyielding, each word delivered with the weight of inevitable justice. The room seemed to shrink, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows that accentuated the gravity of the moment. Ulysses tried to muster a response, his voice trembling as he stammered, but, "We were cleared in court." His protest was cut short by the director's calm yet piercing reply. "A single courtroom victory does not erase a lifetime of corruption," he said. "Your acquittal was merely a momentary escape, a temporary reprieve in a system designed to eventually hold you accountable." The silence that followed was suffocating. The FBI director's revelation was not only a personal reckoning for Ulysses and Wayland but also a turning point for the entire department. Around the table, faces once filled with smug assurance now betrayed shock, fear, and the dawning realization that their carefully guarded secrets were about to be exposed to the full glare of public scrutiny. The director then detailed how federal agents had worked tirelessly, undercover and across multiple jurisdictions, to trace every illicit penny, every whispered deal, every attempt to cover up the truth. His narrative was as methodical as it was damning, each sentence reinforcing the certainty that the walls of their corrupted empire were collapsing. In that charged moment, as the gravity of his words settled over the room, the true scale of the impending reckoning became clear. No longer could the officers hide behind their connections and past glories. The meticulously compiled evidence was irrefutable. The once unassailable duo now faced a future where every lie, every fraudulent act, would be scrutinized in the harsh light of justice. The director's final words echoed in the silent room: "Today, we begin dismantling a network that has long evaded accountability. Justice will prevail, and nothing, no one, is above the law." With those words, the chapter of impunity came crashing down, leaving behind a room filled with the shattered remnants of power and the unmistakable promise of a new era of transparency and reform. In the tense hours that followed the FBI director's revelation, the atmosphere in the precinct transformed into a cauldron of mounting panic and desperation. The once proud faces of Ulysses Hopper and Wayland Stokes, still reeling from the damning evidence laid bare in that conference room, now twisted with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of impending doom. The corridors, earlier echoing with the quiet murmur of administrative reassurances, now resonated with hurried footsteps and whispered confessions as federal agents began their relentless pursuit of the truth. Within a stark, cold interrogation room illuminated by harsh, unyielding fluorescent lights, Ulysses sat rigidly at a metal table, his hands trembling uncontrollably despite his best efforts to maintain composure. Across from him, an agent with a steely gaze and a calm demeanor placed a stack of documents on the table, each piece a testament to months of covert investigation. The agent's voice was measured yet unrelenting as he recounted the intricate network of illicit transactions, falsified reports, and secret communications that Ulysses had helped orchestrate. Every word felt like a blow, shattering the carefully constructed facade of invincibility the officer had maintained for so long. At first, Ulysses tried to evade the questions with feigned indifference, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape that wasn't there. But as the evidence became irrefutable, his defenses crumbled under the weight of the revelations. The minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, during which the silence was punctuated only by the rustle of paper and the measured tapping of the agent's pen. Finally, with a voice choked by resignation and regret, Ulysses began to confess. He recounted, in agonizing detail, every instance of bribery, every falsified record, and every covert meeting that had once seemed so insignificant. His confession was not a plea for mercy, it was an admission of a lifetime steeped in moral decay, a surrender to the inexorable tide of justice that now washed over him. Meanwhile, in another room down the hall, Wayland Stokes experienced a similar unraveling. The interrogation process was equally methodical. Agents, armed with a mountain of corroborative evidence, pressed him relentlessly, unraveling the threads of his involvement with the same precision as a master weaver undoing a tapestry. Wayland's initial resistance gave way to visible panic as the reality of his situation sank in. The confident bravado that had once defined his every action dissolved into a palpable fear, evident in the quiver of his voice and the haunted look in his eyes. In a moment of stark vulnerability, he too offered a full confession, acknowledging his role in the corrupt operations that had plagued the precinct. His words were heavy with remorse, each sentence an acknowledgment of the countless lives adversely affected by his actions and a desperate, futile attempt to justify his past in the hope of some semblance of redemption. As the confessions continued, the interrogation rooms, once isolated and sterile, began to feel like the epicenter of a seismic shift within the entire law enforcement establishment. Agents meticulously recorded every word, every trembling pause, creating an incontrovertible record of wrongdoing that extended far beyond the personal failings of Ulysses and Wayland. The collective confessions not only exposed their individual crimes but also illuminated the deep-rooted corruption that had festered in the shadowy corridors of power for years. Outside these grim proceedings, the public was beginning to take notice. News outlets, once enamored by the audacious courtroom victory, now reported a startling turnaround, a cascade of confessions that promised to unravel an entire network of criminality. The community, reeling from the shock, oscillated between outrage and relief, as the truth, long obscured by a veil of deceit, emerged in stark clarity. Families who had suffered quietly under the weight of corruption found solace in the fact that those responsible were finally being held accountable, while others braced themselves for the transformative changes that would soon reshape their trust in the institutions meant to protect them. In the midst of this crisis, the FBI director's earlier proclamation resonated as a grim reminder of the relentless pursuit of justice. For Ulysses and Wayland, the journey from arrogance to abject contrition was complete, leaving them to face the consequences of a lifetime of misdeeds. As the interrogation sessions drew to a close, the agents involved felt a somber satisfaction tempered by the recognition that the path to true reform was only just beginning. The confessions, raw and unvarnished, had become the cornerstone of a broader investigation aimed at purging the rot that had long infected the system. And though the personal toll was immeasurable, the hope of cleansing the institution, and restoring a measure of honor to the very concept of law enforcement, shone through the darkness, promising a future where accountability and integrity would prevail. In the weeks that followed the explosive revelations, the full force of accountability began to dismantle the once untouchable empire of corruption. The precinct, once a haven for unchecked power, was now in disarray as a cascade of arrests swept through its ranks. Ulysses Hopper and Wayland Stokes found themselves at the center of a maelstrom, their names splashed across headlines and their faces broadcast on every television screen as symbols of systemic betrayal. The media frenzy captured every detail, from the tearful confessions in stark interrogation rooms to the impassioned testimonies of those who had suffered under their regime. Courtrooms became battlegrounds where the truth was relentlessly pursued. Ulysses, his voice subdued and laden with regret, recounted each illicit transaction in every backroom deal with painstaking detail. His words, once filled with arrogant confidence, now resonated with the weight of a man who had been forced to confront the moral decay of a lifetime. Wayland, standing beside him, was no less contrite. His once flamboyant demeanor had been replaced by a palpable sense of vulnerability as he admitted his role in the network of corruption. The testimonies of their former allies and victims added a piercing clarity to the proceedings, painting a grim picture of a system that had long been compromised by greed and deception. Meanwhile, the FBI director, Enoch Spade, played a pivotal role in orchestrating the investigation. His meticulous presentation of evidence, ranging from covert recordings and falsified documents to intercepted communications, revealed the intricate web of deceit that extended far beyond the local precinct. Spade's calm, authoritative demeanor and unwavering commitment to justice lent a newfound legitimacy to the trial, and his words became the rallying cry for a community desperate for change. As the trial unfolded, it became evident that this was not merely a punitive exercise but the beginning of a profound transformation in law enforcement. Outside the courtroom, the impact of the trial rippled through the community. Citizens, who had long harbored a quiet suspicion about the integrity of those entrusted with their safety, now found themselves at the forefront of a public reckoning. Town hall meetings and community forums were convened, where residents voiced both outrage and hope. The collective sentiment was one of cautious optimism, the belief that even the deepest scars of corruption could eventually heal if the truth was allowed to prevail. Families who had been embattled by the consequences of unchecked power began to reclaim their faith in justice, inspired by the courageous stand of those who had finally unmasked the rot at the heart of the system. In the midst of this sweeping reformation, Ulysses and Waylon were compelled to confront the harsh realities of their actions. Prison cells, cold and unforgiving, became the unlikely setting for introspection and transformation. Isolated from the chaos of the outside world, both men underwent rehabilitation programs and counseling sessions, their days marked by a slow, painful process of self-examination and remorse. They attended group meetings with fellow inmates, sharing their stories in a raw and unfiltered manner, in the hope that their painful admissions might serve as a cautionary tale for others. Over time, the narrative shifted from one of pure condemnation to a more nuanced understanding of the human capacity for change, a recognition that redemption, though hard-won, was not beyond reach. Back at the precinct, sweeping reforms were set in motion. The old guard, tainted by years of corruption, was systematically replaced with officers chosen not only for their competence but also for their unwavering moral integrity. New policies were implemented to foster transparency, including stringent oversight mechanisms, regular audits, and community advisory panels that ensured the voices of citizens were heard in every decision. Training programs were overhauled to emphasize ethical conduct and accountability, forging a new generation of law enforcement professionals dedicated to rebuilding public trust. The metamorphosis was slow, yet each incremental change reinforced the belief that a cleaner, more accountable system was possible. As the trial drew to a close, the verdicts delivered in court were both a condemnation of past crimes and a beacon of hope for the future. The sentences handed down to Ulysses and Waylon, while severe, were coupled with the promise that their detailed confessions would contribute to a broader effort to root out corruption at every level. The courtroom, once filled with the bitter tension of retribution, now resonated with the possibility of renewal, a profound shift that signified not an end, but the dawning of a new era in justice. In the end, the fall of Ulysses Hopper and Waylon Stokes transcended the simple narrative of criminal punishment. It became a transformative moment for an entire community and a long-overdue reformation within a flawed institution. The scars of betrayal and injustice would linger, but they now served as a stark reminder of the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. As the city slowly emerged from the shadows of its troubled past, there blossomed a renewed commitment to accountability in ethical governance, a commitment that promised a future where justice was not only served, but also lived every day in the hearts and minds of its people. In the gentle glow of a new dawn, the city awoke to a transformed reality, a reality where the echoes of past corruption were slowly fading, replaced by the vibrant pulse of renewal and accountability. The once tumultuous halls of the courthouse had given way to a new era of transparent justice and community engagement. In this final chapter of a long and painful journey, the impact of the recent trials and sweeping reforms was palpable on every street corner and in every public meeting. Enoch Spade, the unwavering FBI director who had shattered the illusion of invincibility held by Ulysses Hopper and Waylon Stokes, now stood before a crowd of citizens gathered in a renovated public forum. His presence, marked by calm authority and a trace of compassion, resonated deeply with an audience that had suffered under the weight of systemic betrayal for far too long. As he addressed the assembly, his words were measured and sincere, outlining the rigorous new policies that would govern the police department, a department once rife with secrets and impunity. He spoke of community oversight boards, independent audits, and new training programs designed to instill ethical values in every officer sworn to serve. His vision was clear, a future where the law was not wielded as a tool of personal gain, but as a beacon of justice and equality. Across the city, public sentiment shifted from cynicism to cautious optimism. Town halls and community centers became hubs of spirited discussion and collaborative planning. Former victims of police misconduct shared their stories, finding solace and empowerment in the tangible steps being taken to ensure that no one would be left unheard or unprotected again. In neighborhoods once paralyzed by fear, new murals and community gardens sprang up, symbolizing hope and resilience. Local leaders, many of whom had once questioned the integrity of law enforcement, now worked side by side with reformed officials in a united effort to rebuild trust. Within the precinct that had once been the epicenter of corruption, the change was equally profound. A new leadership team, handpicked for their unwavering commitment to justice and integrity, had replaced the old guard. These individuals, many of whom had risen from the ranks of the community, took to heart the lessons of the past. They initiated open forums where officers and civilians could engage in honest dialogue about expectations and responsibilities. Every day, as the sun rose over the city, the once dim corridors of the police station now buzzed with the energy of accountability and renewed purpose. Officers underwent rigorous retraining, not just in tactical skills but in ethics, empathy, and community relations. The transformation was painstaking and gradual, but each incremental improvement rekindled the hope that integrity could indeed triumph over the shadows of corruption. For Ulysses Hopper and Waylon Stokes, the journey took a starkly different turn behind the imposing walls of the correctional facility where they now served time. Stripped of the power and arrogance that had once defined their lives, they were confronted daily with the consequences of their actions. Within the confines of their prison cells, time became both a torment and an unexpected opportunity for introspection. Through mandatory counseling sessions and rehabilitation programs, both men began to peel back layers of denial and bravado, exposing the raw human vulnerabilities beneath. In group therapy sessions, where former criminals shared their stories without judgment, Ulysses and Waylon found themselves opening up about the choices that had led them astray. Their confessions, once forced and contrite, slowly transformed into genuine expressions of regret and a tentative yearning for redemption. Over time, a quiet transformation began to take root, a realization that even those who had perpetrated great wrongs might find a path toward reconciliation with their past. The final act of this tumultuous saga unfolded in the courtroom one crisp spring morning. Amid solemn faces and quiet anticipation, a series of reformative measures were announced that would permanently reshape the landscape of local law enforcement. The judge, speaking with a mix of stern finality and cautious hope, detailed the new framework for police accountability, a framework that promised transparency, community involvement, and relentless oversight. The verdicts and subsequent sentencing of the corrupt officials were not celebrated with unbridled glee but with a sober understanding that justice, while served, was only one part of the larger healing process. The community's outpouring of support for the reforms underscored a collective commitment to learning from the past and building a future where corruption would no longer have a foothold. As the day drew to a close, the FBI director took one last walk through the city. He observed the lively chatter in a rebuilt park, the spirited discussions at a neighborhood council, and the hopeful faces of children playing under the watchful eyes of reformed officers. In every corner, the vestiges of a dark era were being replaced by the vibrant brushstrokes of renewal and unity. Enoch Spade allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction, a belief that the arduous struggle for truth and justice was bearing fruit. His vision of a reformed system was coming to life, not through punitive measures alone, but through the transformative power of collective will and steadfast determination. In that final, reflective moment, the city embraced its new dawn. The scars of corruption would always remain as solemn reminders of a time when trust had been betrayed. Yet they also served as the catalyst for the profound changes that had unfolded, a testament to the resilience of a community determined to rise above its past. And as the first stars of the evening appeared in a clear sky, it was evident that this was not an ending, but rather the beginning of a long, hopeful journey toward a future where justice, compassion, and truth reigned supreme.